The next speaker is MarkGober. He came over from America yesterday, a little jet lag, I guess. He was, in his previous life, a partner in a technology group in Silicon Valley. He was an investment banker with UBS. He graduated cum laude from Princeton University. It's a quick thinker and speaker, so slow down, not too much. It's not a native language. But MarkGober is author of several books. The End to Upside Down Thinking, Upside Down Liberty, Upside Down Reset en Medicine. In de wereld heeft hij een bepaalde visie die misschien erg interessant is voor jullie. MarkGober, I would like to introduce you. Please come.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Jan, for inviting me here today. As Jan mentioned, I've written a number of books. They all have a similar theme, which is that things are upside down. And I actually never expected to write books. As Jan mentioned, my background is in business. I used to work in investment banking and then in Silicon Valley. And while I was working in Silicon Valley, in 2016, I started to realize that the way I thought about reality was not actually scientifically correct. And that led me to write An End to Upside Down Thinking. And at that point, I thought, I'm done. I'm not going to write any more books. But then as I looked at more and more things, I realized that more and more concepts were upside down, which has led me to research things like medicine and liberty and other topics. And 2 of my books have been translated into Dutch, and they're published by Success Spoken, and I'm actually signing books downstairs if you're interested in taking a look at them. But the 2 books that have been translated into Dutch are An End to Upside Down Liberty and An End to Upside Down Medicine. This talk will focus primarily on liberty, and I'll give a few hints as to what I've discussed in the medicine book. But more generally speaking, I want to speak today about the topic of freedom. And for me, this was actually a new area up until 2020. Prior to that, I was focused on business, and then I was focused on consciousness, which is the topics of my first 2 books, really. And then everything happened with COVID in 2020, and also the US election, Trump versus Biden. And people would ask me, what do you think about politics? And I didn't really have an opinion on it. So I started looking into things, and I realized that there were issues on both sides that I didn't fully align with. So I began to look more fundamentally at what is freedom and what is the role of government in the world. And I'll talk about some of those concepts today. I'm not going to be advocating for any particular politician, but rather concepts that we can all use as we think about evaluating the political landscape, which is something we all have to do these days. So the central idea, and this is very counter to what I was taught. I was taught government is here to protect you and to save you, and we should look up to government to help us. The central idea today is that the way that we do government around the world is inherently tyrannical. What I mean by that is I'm not criticizing any particular politicians per se. I'm talking about the structure itself lends itself to tyranny because of the way it's set up. And this is the really big part that got me super interested because of my work on consciousness, is that the way we do government violates natural law. So as we look at governments around the world, at least from my perspective, we should be moving toward smaller government, less centralization, if we want to get more in alignment with natural law. The current paradigm of government around the world is known as statism. And this diagram I'm showing here is from a book by Larkin Rose called The Most Dangerous Superstition. But it doesn't paint a very pleasant picture of what government is, because it shows all the people, and then their law enforcers, and then the few lawmakers on top. It's not what we're shown in school, is it? No. The logic of statism is basically that human beings are allowed to rule over other human beings. And this is something that we allow because of what I think is faulty logic. So let's think about it. We need to have the state to rule over us because human beings are not trustworthy. And that's not a bad assumption to start with. The problem is that we take a subset of people that we already said we didn't trust, and we put them into power over everyone else. Does that make sense? But then we say, don't worry about it because we're just going to select the right people into power. But you don't trust them, so how could you trust them to select the right people into power? And they say, don't worry, we're going to have elections to do this properly. But we don't trust people, so how would we trust them to run fair elections? So the logic is fundamentally faulty. I also want to mention just some basic features of the state under this statist way that we run government all over the world. It's a political monopoly in a certain jurisdiction, if you really think about it. And monopoly is kind of a bad word in economics, and yet we appoint this, we don't appoint, we have a political monopoly that governs all the other monopolies, and we forget that there's a political monopoly there in the first place. So that's fundamentally problematic. But also, when I worked in business, contracts were a big part of my work. So I worked at a firm where we advised other companies in Silicon Valley and in New York. And this is how it works with any service provider typically, is that you have a contract that specifies what the service provider is going to do, and a customer hires that service provider to do those things, and you agree on everything in advance. You agree on the price, you agree on what the service provider is actually going to do, you agree on termination, what happens if the service provider fails to do the things that it said it would do, and that's all written, and it's mutually agreed upon, it's all very explicit. But in political theory and government, the way we do it with statism, we have a social contract. Has anyone ever seen the social contract? I would love to know what it says. But apparently we're beholden to this. And interestingly, one of my books is about the Great Reset, the World Economic Forum's stated vision for society. And the idea, part of the idea is that we need a new social contract. And I'm confused because I don't know what the original one was. So it's a big deal because we have this structure in society that basically has special privileges relative to any other type of service provider. And this is not to say that government isn't important in terms of what it provides. Government provides legal services, roads, military. These are all very important things, but it's done under the umbrella of this arguably illogical structure that lends itself to tyranny versus having a real contract that everyone has agreed on. And some people will say, well, we have a democratic system, and therefore it's okay. The problem with that is you still end up with tyranny, where you have some people getting to decide what other people can and can't do, even if it's the majority. But what if the majority is wrong about something? And didn't we already say we don't trust people? So why would we trust some people to then impose on others? So we end up in not a voluntary democracy, but rather a compulsory one. It's very different than, let's say, 3 people get together and all agree beforehand and sign a contract saying, if the majority of us agree on something, then we can override the third person, 2 versus 1. If you all agree on that beforehand in a contract explicitly, that's a voluntary democracy versus right now, you might not have elected someone, but then that person can impose something on you because the majority said it was okay. And this is part of the logic that we're really not taught in school. We're taught democracy equals good, but is compulsory democracy good? If we think about how government obtains its revenue, compare that to a service provider, a lawyer. You pay a lawyer for services rendered. If the lawyer doesn't do a good job, you hire a new one. The lawyer isn't going to force you to pay it without a contract that you've signed beforehand or some kind of agreement. The way it works with government is taxation. So we're told this is a way of basically giving to society, but we can be forced to pay for things that we didn't actually want to pay for. So an extreme interpretation of this is that your property, your money, is being taken by the government, and therefore it is actually theft versus a voluntary payment. Government also gets to define morality through its laws. It gets to tell you what is good and bad, and that's sort of arbitrary, that a few people get to determine what is good and bad, and you have to be beholden to that. And yet government at the same time, according to Larkin Rose, the philosopher I mentioned before, government has an exemption from morality, basically, where it can do something and claim that it's moral, such as taking your money, but in an ordinary circumstance, that would be theft. So normal morality doesn't usually apply to government. So my point here is that there are many things we just take for granted because it's how society works. And if we look at how it actually operates, it's not quite as benevolent. And this is a problematic thing because our entire world operates under this structure. One of my favorite quotes here from an economist, Hans Hermann Hoppe. The state unilaterally fixes the rules of the game, the laws, and can change them by legislation during the game. That's a great position to be in, isn't it? And Murray Rothbard, another economist, he defines government in a very different way than what I was taught. He says, the state is that organization in society which attempts to maintain a monopoly of the use of force and violence in a given territorial area. In particular, it is the only organization in society that obtains its revenue not by voluntary contribution or payment for services rendered, but by coercion. Meaning, if you don't pay your taxes, we're going to lock you up. But it's voluntary. That's what we often hear, is that you're just doing it for the greater good. So it's not a real form of charity, because people certainly could donate on their own accord, whereas with government it is through coercion. This has big implications for economics too, because economics in the current world under statism operates under the state. So that means the government ends up steering society, it's steering our economy in many ways. This is inherently problematic, and I'm getting now into the Austrian School of Economics, where human beings' behaviors and preferences are inherently unpredictable. So I'll give you an example. Let's say someone really likes chocolate cake, and that's his favorite dessert. And then one day he says, you know what, I like apple pie more. I don't like chocolate cake as much. So that person is then going to start buying chocolate cake and not consuming, that person will start consuming apple pie and not chocolate cake. This is fundamental within a marketplace, because a marketplace is people just buying the things they want and then service providers providing those services in accordance with the demand. And if someone's trying to centrally plan the economy, you need to have a good picture of the supply and the demand and what the people actually want in the economy. And I just mentioned a dessert preference for one person, hypothetically, but imagine one human being who has many, many preferences for things, and those preferences are changing unpredictably all the time. That's one person. How could any central planner possibly know what's best for the entire economy? It's actually impossible. So this is one of the big dangers of central planning, because you end up with people who are basically just doing what they think is best, but that might not be what is best for you. And is that real freedom? Now, if this topic is of interest to you, the Mises Institute, based in Auburn, Alabama, has many resources and actually free books on its website. Another one of my favorite quotes. When buying and selling are controlled by legislation, the first things to be bought and sold are legislators. A big problem with an economy that's run by politicians, because is it really any sort of a free market if the politicians are making the rules of the game and they can be bought or at least influenced? So often we hear people talk about free markets always within the context of statism. It will never be a free market under the state. It's impossible because the politicians ultimately have a say over how the economy works. Now I'm going to get into an area that we typically don't hear about in the realm of political theory, which is the nature of reality itself and natural law. I'll go through this quickly because many of my books talk about this in detail, and also my Liberty book goes into this. But the near-death experience is a phenomenon that's been reported throughout history where a person is in some kind of trauma to the body, let's say cardiac arrest, their heart stops, they're about to die, blood stops flowing to their brain. So their brain is either completely off or barely functional, and yet people report a very elaborate experience. They say it's realer than real life, and when they're resuscitated, the doctor can't believe it because the doctor says, how could that be possible? We know what your body was doing. You couldn't have had that. It must have been a hallucination. And yet there are many people, many credible scientists who have been studying this and saying, wait, maybe something else is going on. I show here Dr. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist. He published a paper in the Lancet Medical Journal in which almost 20% of cardiac arrest survivors reported a near-death experience. It should be 0% when someone's clinically dead. And there's also a phenomenon known as the veridical out-of-body experience. This is during a near-death experience. Not everyone reports it, but some do, where the person's consciousness, meaning their mind is still active, and it's actually seeing things from a perspective outside the body. So they see what's happening in the operating room from above their body. Sometimes their consciousness is outside the room. I know it sounds crazy, but these cases have been reported where a person is resuscitated and they tell the doctor what happened. And the doctor says, that's accurate, but it's impossible because you should have been clinically dead. So even if there was a little bit of stuff happening in your brain, it should not have been capable of producing that kind of a verified memory. Because if it's a verified, accurate memory, it's not a hallucination. That's the key point. If there's anything that's verified as accurate during the time that the brain was basically off, it's not a hallucination. Where am I going with this? If it's not a hallucination, then maybe we can learn something about the broader reality from these near-death experiences. What often happens in near-death experiences, in let's say 20 to 30% of the cases, people have a life review. They relive their whole life, and many religions have talked about this for a long time, but this is being reported in modern times too. People will say, I became all the people that I impacted during my life, and I got to feel what it was like to be them. I got to feel the good things that I did for them and the not so good things. And I show here my podcast series, Where Is My Mind, which is on Apple Podcast. I produced this with Blue Duck Media in 2019. But I interviewed a man named Dannion Brinkley, and that conversation had a major effect on my life because he had multiple near-death experiences. So he was struck by lightning. He had open heart surgery twice, brain surgery once. And each time he had a life review like this, where he relived everything in his life. And what he told me was that he relived his combat days fighting in Vietnam, in the Vietnam War. He felt what it was like to kill someone from the perspective of the person he killed. And he also felt what it was like to be children who would no longer have a father because he had killed the father in combat. So he felt everything. And when he came back, he changed all of his preferences. He became a hospice volunteer. And then in his later near-death experiences, which he didn't know he was going to have, he felt what it was like to comfort someone who was dying. So he felt the good and the bad. The point is that there seems to be a golden rule that's built into the fabric of reality itself. Something about the way we treat people is beyond just morality, the way we think it sounds nice. There's something in reality itself that people are coming back over and over again reporting that we learn from these near-death experiences. And actually, Dr. Bruce Grayson, I also interviewed him for my podcast, but he wrote a book called After. This is a medical doctor from the University of Virginia studying these cases. He says, experiencers often describe the golden rule not as a moral guideline we should strive to follow, but as a description of how the world works, a law of nature. So if we just think about that for a second, that we should treat other people well, that's the golden rule. How does that align with politics and the way we structure society? This leads to the non-aggression principle, which is very basic. To me, it's a corollary of the golden rule and what we learn from near-death experiences. Don't initiate aggression against anyone's body or the property they own. And the property they own could be money, land, anything. Aggression could be violence. It could be fraud, theft, coercion. Don't initiate. And if someone initiates against you, you have a right to self-defense. That's the basic principle, and it's in alignment with what we can glean is a potential natural law from science. So now I've looked at politics from a whole new lens. Anytime I hear about a policy, I'm thinking about it from the perspective of the non-aggression principle and natural law. Is this policy initiating aggression against people? And the answer is usually yes. So we end up in a place where, because we live under statism, and in the book I describe a future that's beyond statism, but since we're in statism now, the question becomes, when are we initiating aggression less? It would be preferred. It would be more preferred under this idea of natural law. And there's also the potential to get caught up in things that sound compassionate from the government that actually aren't so compassionate. So I'll just give two quick examples. One is climate, the climate crisis that we hear about so much. And this is a big part of the Great Reset, where the government says, potentially, well, we need to tax you more to save the environment. Or maybe you should travel less. It sounds really nice because maybe some people think that will help save the environment, but actually it's reducing freedom. Another one, we all just lived through this. The COVID, where the government says, we're going to protect you from this virus and trust the science. We hear that a lot. And now I'm just briefly going to touch on some of the topics from medicine, from my book on medicine, because it's very central to government and what we all just lived through. Because if we're going to follow policies that are allegedly based on science, then the information should come from the scientific method, which means that those experiments should have an independent variable and proper controls. Very basic things. And yet, there are issues that we've seen with SARS-CoV-2. And these are actual statements from the government health agencies. Freedom of information requests have been submitted to over 200 health agencies all over the world. And they have said that they haven't purified a sample of just the virus, which is a problem because you need that to have an independent variable and proper controls, which you would need in order to follow the scientific method. And if you're going to have policies that aren't based on the scientific method, that's kind of problematic. And yet we're told this is to help you, this is to protect you. So discernment is a really critical part of this. And my last point is, I think there's something that I've experienced in just exploring all of these concepts. Something in the mind shifts. It's almost like the veil's lifted a bit, and then one's behavior can start to shift. And to say, oh, I'm not going to listen to that because that's actually tyrannical. Or I'm not going to do that because that would be a form of tyranny by me, and I don't want to do that. So it's going to be up to each of us as to how we take in this information and integrate it. But it starts, to me, with the mind. And I'm happy to discuss these topics more. I will be downstairs again signing books, An End to Upside Down Liberty and An End to Upside Down Medicine, published by Success Spoken. And thank you all for your time today. Thank you.